these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Well, at the moment, we can vote on our mobile phones as long as we're in the building.
Okay. Well, we're already recording, so let's. I want to talk about that for a second. So, so I wonder so I can't tell what the hell these bells mean. I don't understand. Like, there's a clock up there, and the lights come on, and bells start ringing. I've never been able to figure out what the code is. Okay, like what it actually means. Did we get this from you guys? Is this from you?
I fear you must have done, because I agree. You know, we get the same bell whether it's the Commons or the Lords that's voting, and you have to look up and see whether it's a green bell that's swinging or a red bell to tell whether or not it's you or the other guys who are voting.
Well, that's slightly easier. And you can vote. And you can vote on your phone. So, is there an app?
Yeah, it's quite well designed. I mean, it's obviously since the pandemic only. Before that, we voted in person by walking through the division lobbies. But then they brought in remote voting with an app, and it works quite well. But then when we came back to participating fully, as we did a few weeks ago, they said you can vote on the app still, but only if you're on the premises.
Okay. Oh. That's interesting. So that's a little bit more restrictive than we have. We do remote proxy voting, but you have to plan for it ahead of time.
Right. The Commons does that. You can give your vote to somebody else.
Oh.
We can't do that in the law for some reason.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, we're trying to. I think if we win the majority back, we will probably get rid of that and make everybody come in. Like, because a lot of us rebelled against the proxy voting. It just feels wrong. I mean, I'm not really sure what the other reasoning is. It just feels wrong.
And also, there's at least a pretense that you must have listened to the argument if you're in the building.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly a fair point. I know, of course, we both know nobody listens to any arguments these days, and maybe we'll talk about that. The politics of argumentation. And gosh, I like to talk to you, maybe dive into a few of the things we talked about last time when you were on the podcast. Thought we had a really interesting conversation. And if you didn't read the title of the podcast, we of course have Lord Matt Ridley back on. He is a repeat offender. He is a Viscount. And if you listen to the last podcast, I finally learned what a Viscount was, although since that time I'm pretty sure I've forgotten it. So there's maybe so far so good. You write a lot of books, so you got. I think I talked to you about another book last time we spoke, but this time you wrote an interesting book on the origin of COVID-19 called Viral. Let's talk about that, and but then I really want to talk about the nature of conservatism. You're a thoughtful guy, and I always find it interesting to speak to, let's say, I don't know if you call yourself a conservative. I know you've pushed back against the label right wing, but you're certainly a free market thinker. Limited government
party, as it's called, but very much on the sort of liberal libertarian, classical liberal wing of that party, I would say, rather than the authoritarian wing, particularly at the moment. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what that other wing is. It's authoritarian in every way. But let's talk about this origin of COVID-19. So let me premise it with this. I've read through your kind of the outline of all your chapters and skimmed through it, and it's very convincing. Now, it's easy to convince me on this because I was already convinced that, and I've also seen classified intelligence that suggests I'm not sure I see another option besides a lab leak theory, but that's kind of taken for granted here in the U.S. To be honest, especially on the right, and frankly, I think most people believe it at this point. Even though that was taboo to say a while back. What do you think? What else do we need to know? What are we missing?
Well, just a couple of points on that, actually. The first is to say that Alina Chan and I, she's a co-author on this book, neither of us think that it's definitive that it was a lab leak yet. We don't think we can decide either way yet. We've moved from thinking it was unlikely to be a lab leak to thinking that we lean towards the probability that it was. So we do actually in the book present the case for the market. And towards the end of the book, we have the microphone to an attorney summing up before a jury saying, convince the jury it came from the market. And we have a chapter in which, we both wrote the best case we could for that. And it's quite convincing in some ways. And then we hand the microphone to the other attorney and say, convince us it came from the lab. And I find that slightly more convincing at the moment. But I wouldn't go much further than that yet. I want to sort of keep an open mind. But the other point I want to just make is, you said pretty well everybody accepts it's a lab leak now in the US. If you look at the polls, that's true. Something like 70%, even a majority of Democrat voters accept that that's a likely or probable hypothesis. But if you look at the mainstream media, the columnists, the commentators, or you look at the scientific establishment, are still taking the line that anyone who espouses a laboratory leak as a source of this pandemic is a nutter or a conspiracy theorist or something like that. The gap opened up between the ordinary people and the elite, as it were, on this, and I think that's quite an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like the mainstream media is just dead set on believing the narrative that they had already spun. Remember, it was very taboo to ever suggest that there could be any kind of lab leak. And I don't know why. I mean, did you guys dive into the psychology of that, perhaps? Why? And frankly, I have the same question on so many issues surrounding COVID. The psychology of the resistance to allow these counter narratives to spread, even though they're perfectly reasonable. So let me give you a couple more examples, not just the lab leak theory, but ivermectin, being not, or hydroxychloroquine, or, and look, maybe these things aren't effective. Maybe we don't know, but they're certainly not harmful. So the outrage against them was frankly irrational. Or natural immunity, another example. I don't understand where this came from. I have been struggling to figure it out. I don't know if you have any theories on that either.
Well, if we'd had a pandemic like this 25 years ago, I sort of agree with you. I think we'd have seen more reasonable disagreement. One guy says, masks do work. Another guy says masks don't work. There's a debate. Let's turn to Professor A to make the case and somebody else to make the other case. Let's have an argument. Whereas today, it seems like the first thing you do when you take up a position is paint the other side as not just wrong but evil, and not just probably wrong but definitely wrong. And it just. And that's happening, frankly, on both sides of the aisle. I mean, I think, some of the anti-vaxxers who I see on social media seem to me to be just as sort of irrationally convinced of the evilness of vaccines as others are convinced of the evilness of anti-vaxxers. So it's a phenomenon of the polarization of the world that social media has played a large part in, I think. We seem to be able to polarize debates very quickly here. I mean, you had that with the election of Donald Trump. We had it the same year with Brexit. We had it before that, funnily enough, with the Scottish referendum here, where Scottish people got very angry with each other very quickly. And I remember that was the first time I really noticed that this was sort of happening in a way that was different from before.
Well, were they just talking as Scots talk, and you thought they were acting angry? Because I mean, come on, they kind of sound.
That point. Well, no, I think they were angry. I mean, some of the words they were using.
I was up at COP26 in Scotland recently, and had interesting conversations with one of the ministers there, who is utterly convinced that Scottish independence was imminent within the next 10 years. So what say you to that?
I don't know, but I suspect he's wrong. I think the high watermark for the independence movement for now may have passed, and the reason for that is because they had a big lift from Brexit, saying Britain has taken us out of the European Union against our will, or that England has, and then in the pandemic they handed a lot of power to the Scottish government to, as it were, put its case across, because all the health regulations had to come through the Scottish government rather than the British government. So there was a lot going for independence in the last couple of years. And I think that'll fade. And the Scottish National Party has now been running Scotland for quite a long time. And the economic indicators, the education indicators, the health indicators are all terrible. It's as if they're not succeeding very well. So I think that they've had a good go at getting close to independence, and I don't think they'll quite put it off.
So is that analogous? Help an American understand this. It's not like they're another state. Is it more like they're Puerto Rico? Like what would be the right analogy?
Yeah, Puerto Rico is a district, isn't it? It's almost run, but no, it's not like Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico's run by the federal government more, because it doesn't have state senators and congressmen.
Well, it is right. I mean, they have Congress. They have a congressional representative that doesn't vote but can say things. They don't have any senators. They do have a governor, of course. They don't pay federal taxes, but and so they don't get quite the federal money that maybe another state would, but they still get some. So they're still U.S. citizens. They have U.S. passports. It's confusing for us too, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm just quickly voting. So Scotland. About 20 years ago, Tony Blair gave Scotland a degree of devolution, where certain government functions were taken, decisions were taken in Edinburgh instead of London, but other ones were not. So foreign policy and things like that, they have no independent ability to foreign defence policy, most tax policy, although there's a little bit of leeway on tax, but a lot of social, educational, health policy, they can run a different show. But they don't, on the whole, raise their own taxes. So they're semi-independent in that sense. And that was the idea was that would kill the desire for independence. It hasn't worked out that way. In fact, the desire for independence has grown. I think Canada is the clearest example you can find, because they had this with Quebec for 20 years, and I don't know if you had this experience, but Canadian friends would the first thing they'd say when they came through the door was, "Oh my God, Quebec's going to go independent any day." And you would say, "Well, you said that last year and the year before and the year before." And then eventually it quietened down, and Quebec didn't go independent, and Canada stayed together. I suspect we'll have the same with the UK, but we haven't worked out a way of allowing Scotland to feel different and run itself differently, and yet still be part of the same. Their problem at the moment is they want to be independent, but they want to join the European Union.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask, because that was one of the main arguments he was making. I was like, well, what do you gain from this? From a practical perspective, what on earth do you gain from this? And they're like, we get to be governed by Brussels. I was like, it's stupid.
And they have to give up their currency. I mean, they'd have to join the euro. Any state that joins the European Union now has to agree to join the euro.
How's Brexit going, by the way?
Well, not as well as it could. There's no question of going back on it, because the Brussels and Paris have been so rude to us ever since that we're not going to change our mind. But what we've not done is embrace the opportunities to liberate our economy that should have come immediately after Brexit. We've done a little bits here and there. But just to take an issue that I'm very interested in, gene editing is something that's basically impossible to do in the European Union. Now we're out of the European Union, we can allow agriculture to use this wonderful technology, And instead of saying, yes, let's go for it, we've said, let's have a consultation, then we'll think about changing the law maybe next year. And, we're just being very, very slow about making a dash for the liberalized economy that we expect. But in other ways, it's going well. We were told to expect an exodus of business from the finance industry in London to Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Paris. The reverse has happened, actually. London's got stronger than ever, partly because it's not in the European Union, and partly because it's a big financial center like New York. And,
in any case, none of the doomsday scenarios that were laid out by the stay crowd ever materialized. It's like many things in life. Many things. So sorry, I am going to get back to the COVID origins, but I have a lot of the questions that I got distracted with. One of the things that stood out to me at COP26 was Scotland's claim that they're 100% renewable. And that's in a sense true. There's so much wind on the North Sea, and it's kind of a perfect geographic area for a high amount of wind use. Now, the wind doesn't always blow, and these last couple of years they've had much less windy days than they anticipated. It's been a problem, and we ask, what do you do when that happens? And they say, well, we just import power from England. We're on the same grid. Well, of course, but England uses a mix of nuclear and gas and coal, just like everybody else. Yep. And but of course, the UK's overall plan is to go to 100% renewables. This is what I keep hearing, with some nuclear mixed in. And then I ask again, what do you do when there's no wind? And they say, well, we'll import it from France, and they have nuclear. Those don't turn off. But you left the European Union. What if the French are being French about it? What do you do? I'm just curious. Energy is something I deal with quite a bit, and we couldn't get those questions answered about baseload energy. Republicans in the U.S. we're always talking. That's when we come into these conversations. We say, fine, let's make it cleaner, but what do you do about baseload energy? Because you can only define baseload energy as gas, coal, or nuclear. There is nothing else. Correct. Maybe hydro, I guess, but that's very specific to certain locations. So, how does the UK? What are your conversations like on this?
Well, I'm really worried. I think the UK is going down a very dangerous path towards greater and greater dependence on so-called renewables. Unreliables is another word for them. And as you say, there comes a moment when we suddenly don't have enough, and we have to get it through the interconnector from France or the interconnector from Norway. And if those guys haven't got enough power to spare any, because they've gone to renewables as well, then we've got a problem. And we're seeing this, particularly in the last year. There's been enormous spikes in the price that the grid has to pay for electricity, caused by still cold weather when the wind doesn't blow. And suddenly the grid is out there saying, anybody got any power they can spare? Anybody got a gas-fired power station that's off mothballed that you can bring back online quickly tomorrow or something like that? And that's a recipe for an unstable and hugely expensive way of generating electricity. You're absolutely right. Base load is key, and we're not going to find it just by having, there was a theory that if we had enough wind farms in different parts of Europe, the wind would always be blowing somewhere. Mm-hmm. Well, A, that's not true. And B, the infrastructure to get it from one place to another is terrifying. So, for example, Scotland has more wind farms than England, as you say. It's often blowing a lot in Scotland, so that they're producing more electricity than they need. So they're exporting it to England. But it turns out that the cables are not strong enough to take all of it to England, so they have to pay wind farms in Scotland to switch off, to not produce electricity, pay them an extra fee not to so the most profitable wind farms in Scotland are the ones that are paid to not produce electricity. And this just feels like it's ripping off the poor old taxpayer. to an extraordinary extent.
It's just inefficient too. I mean, if you're a fan of efficiency, it's just inefficient. And my question on these subjects is always, and what is the benefit? I mean, you can get human beings to impose some costs on themselves if there's a very clear benefit. If I'm truly saving my own life or my grandkids' life, well, all right, I'll make some sacrifices. The problem is that's not what the science says. No serious scientist will say that we're saving anybody's life. It's simply not true. And so, in the climate debate, you can't be a denier because that would also be anti-scientific. But but alarmism is also very anti-scientific, and we have to argue with their premise on climate change to an extent, at least, and show that and people are just blown away when I just repeat what the UN IPCC arguments actually are. There will be a cost of climate change, but it's like a 4% decrease in global GDP in 100 years. Exactly. When you think of it in that term, you're like, that's nothing. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's pretty damn close to nothing.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I mean, I had that the other day with someone standing up and saying, and I said, well, actually the damage isn't that great. What? How can you say that? Yeah. They lose their minds. It's not me that's saying that. It's the UN that's saying that. But just back to the reliability of energy point. Last week I had 5 days without electricity at my home. I wasn't the only one. Lots of people. We had a really bad storm. Came out of the north, 98-mile-an-hour winds, unusual direction for strong winds like that. Knocked down a lot of trees, brought down a lot of power lines, snapped a lot of telegraph poles, and so on. And the company that runs the grid was just a bit slow off the mark in mending this. So a lot of us were left without power for 5 days. In my case, 10 days. One or two places are still without power today. And it's very dark at this time of year. We're on the same latitude as Juneau, Alaska here. We about 7 or 8 hours of daylight if we're lucky. So, if I didn't have a gas hob to heat some water on to wash in, if I didn't have a diesel car to charge my phone in, as well as drive around in, then I'd have been in much worse trouble still. And both of those things are about to be banned by my government. They want to phase out all diesel and petrol cars, and they want to phase out gas heating and gas cooking. Last week's events have reminded me and a lot of my neighbors that this is not an easy sell to tell us all we're only going to have electricity, and that electricity is only going to be dependent on the wind, when the wind can be a pretty vicious neighbor.
Well, the Conservative Party's in charge there, right? I mean, and yet we're still going on down this path.
Yeah, no, it's very puzzling. The Conservative Party decided a couple of years ago that it would embrace environmentalism and particularly renewable energy on a much more spectacular scale than even the Labour Party had done, as a way of buying votes or something. But I think a lot of it's coming from the fact that the renewable energy industry has been using the subsidies it's been getting to do political lobbying, frankly. So there's a crony capitalist element to all this.
Imagine that. I have the same idea about here as well, because I can't for the life of me understand why the left dismisses nuclear energy as the obvious solution if you really cared about climate change and emissions.
I completely agree. It's the obvious thing that we should all be doing. It would solve the problem.
All right, I want to come back to political philosophy, but I did promise you we'll talk about the book a little bit more. One of the things that stands out to me about the sort of COVID cover up and the lab leak theory cover up is this guy, Dr. Peter Daszak. Is that the right way to say his name? Dr. Peter Daszak is the head of EcoHealth Alliance. Really loyal listeners of the podcast will remember we've talked about this with my friend and colleague Mike Gallagher. Tell us about why this guy is squirrely in layman's terms.
I'm not sure I know what that word means, but I can guess. Peter Daszak is a British-born American resident scientist who very entrepreneurially turned a wildlife Conservation Foundation into a wildlife virus hunting foundation. And he gets $17 million a year or so from the US government, from the Pentagon, from NIH, I should say, and from overseas development. And that work goes to looking for viruses in the wild in various parts of the world, but particularly in China, and collaborating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, among other laboratories in the world, to study those viruses, sequence them, do experiments on them, etc. And this work goes back 10 years or so. It's been very successful in terms of turning out lots of papers, lots of results, lots of experiments. And it's a very close collaboration. Peter Daszak and Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Institute of Virology are very good friends, and they talk about karaoke parties together and things like that. And yet, when the pandemic started, Peter Daszak orchestrated a letter to the Lancet magazine, although his role in orchestrating it was only revealed later, saying this couldn't have come out of the laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That was a crackpot conspiracy theory, and all lab-based origins could be ruled out. And he said at the bottom of that letter that he declared no, he got 27 other scientists to sign it, they declared no conflict of interest. That felt wrong, and about a year later, the Lancet eventually bowed to pressure and said actually they did have a conflict of interest. They were close friends and collaborators and funders of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But he's been very, very vocal for a year and a half in saying that we can rule out a laboratory-based scenario for the origin of this virus. He got appointed to the World Health Organization investigation into this, again, a massive conflict of interest. When asked, please will you use your close connection with the Wuhan Institute of Virology scientists to tell us more about the database that they've taken offline, which might have useful sequences in it, he said, no, I'm not going to ask them for that because I know what's in the database and it's of no relevance. Well, then all the more reason to share it with us. So it's really very difficult to see him after all these months as being anything other than extremely unhelpful to those trying to look into the origin of this virus. And it's got to the point where he and his collaborators are really very difficult to get information out of. And yet they're the people who know this research best. And if the Wuhan Institute of Virology is not connected with the source of this virus, they should be rushing out everything they know to try and emphasize try and show that there is no connection, instead of which they just criticize everyone else for even speculating about it. I'll give you a very specific example. Just when we were finishing our book, a document was leaked, which was an application by Peter Daszak to the Pentagon, to DARPA, for $14 million to work on bat-borne coronaviruses in China, and do so in a way that would help the US military eventually by giving them an app on their phone to tell them when they were near a dangerous bat cave or something. There was some pretty wacky stuff like that. But it also included a proposition that when they found new coronaviruses, one of the things they might do was put a thing called a furin cleavage site into them, which makes them slightly more infectious. Considerably more infectious, in order to be able to grow them in the laboratory. Now, the interesting thing about that is that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the pandemic, is the only SARS-like virus we know in the entire world that has a furin cleavage site in it, that has one of these features in it. And that's what makes it so infectious. I mean, it's the main reason we're having a pandemic and not just a local outbreak. So at Peter Daszak in 2018, he was the lead name on this application, had applied to put one of these features into one of these viruses in 2018, and he hadn't volunteered that information any time in the last 2 years.
Now that application was rejected by DARPA?
Rejected, yeah.
But what's interesting about reason you bring it up is because it shows that he was interested in doing this exact thing.
Exactly. And also, remember, when you write a grant application as a scientist, quite often what you do is you put in the application something you already know how to do or you've already started.
Of course.
And
interesting.
By the way, the US government wasn't the main funder of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So if they were thinking of doing these experiments, it's not clear whether they were going to do them in Wuhan or North Carolina, but it's possibly both. But it's easily possible that the Chinese Academy of Sciences picked up the opportunity and funded the experiments themselves. So, we can't prove that they ever did put a furin cleavage site into a SARS-like virus. But if they did, it would be highly relevant information. And it's surely not unreasonable for us to ask people like Peter Daszak to tell us what he knows about things like that, rather than having to find out through leaks.
Right. This is a question our Energy and Commerce Committee is focused on as well, because he's particularly has refused to cooperate after we've sent oversight letters, and we sent a letter to the National Academy of Medicine regarding his misconduct. And it seems at this point that some kind of subpoena would be in order.
Yeah, I agree. He's been invited, I think, to testify for the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee in London next week. I don't know whether he'll agree to that. But I can't get information out of him because he blocks me on Twitter, doesn't reply to my emails, etc.
Really?
Yeah. And just 2 weeks ago, I wrote an article pointing out that the discovery of a very closely related virus in Laos was interesting because the EcoHealth Alliance had been collecting viruses in Laos and sending them to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The EcoHealth Alliance tweeted that I was wrong about that. They had never done such a thing. So I said, well, in that case, how do you explain this piece of paper, which is basically a document showing about 120 viruses collected in Laos, stored at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and collected by the EcoHealth Alliance? And I used one example of one virus where they'd done that from bats. And there's been a deafening silence ever since from their Twitter account. I've reminded them at sort of 4-day intervals that they still haven't responded to my perfectly reasonable request, and I'm getting nothing out of them. This is not the behavior. I mean, we're not dealing with the Chinese Communist Party here. We're dealing with a New York-based foundation that gets money from the US taxpayer to do this kind of thing, and it ought to be prepared to answer reasonable questions from people like me.
And I don't understand why our government doesn't have more interest in this. Republicans do, but the Democrats don't. And I honestly fail to understand why. It's a political win to be holding people accountable if they've been hiding things about the origins of COVID. I see no political issues with that, and yet they don't do it. It's rather strange.
I had one theory about that, which was that in the run-up to COP26, with the administration wanting Chinese collaboration on climate policy, they might want to back off too much aggression on that. But even that wouldn't, we're not talking about the Chinese government here, we're talking about the EcoHealth Alliance. So I agree with you. I think it's genuinely puzzling. It's as if they genuinely don't want the answer to come out because of the effect it might have on scientific research, the effect it might have on relations with China. I don't know.
Yeah, other doctors have told me that gain of function research is really a thing of the past, that you can get the same benefit through computer modeling at this point in time. You don't need to maybe weaponize is the wrong word, but for lack of a better term, weaponize these viruses just to study them. It just causes these obvious concerns, and obviously the cost has outweighed the benefit at this point.
Right. That's an interesting point about the computer modeling being telling you what you need. It's certainly true that there's a lot of computer modeling of the shape of the spike protein on a new virus. Will that be able to bind to human ACE2 receptor or not? And you can get a pretty good answer out of that. It's never quite definitive. It's never as good as doing the wet experiment and finding out whether it really does. But you're right. If we can do it in silico, then let's not do it in vitro in the lab, because some of the experiments they've done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology on SARS-like coronaviruses found in bats to mix and match their spike genes with backbones from other viruses have resulted in significant increases in the infectivity and or the virulence of viruses. Whether that broke the rules on gain of function is for the theological argument between Fauci and Rand Paul, which I don't plan to get into. But whether it was gain of function, there's absolutely no doubt.
Yeah. Last question on this particular subject is, let's assume, I think the evidence points to a lab leak theory. It's not a slam dunk. I just think that in my opinion, the evidence eliminates just about all other possibilities and leaves us with this theory. I think that's why I land on it. But let's say we did have a slam dunk theory and the world united with an actual policy agenda on China to deal with this. I'm not sure that we've really thought through what that would look like. What would we do about it?
I agree. I think it's not easy to work out what we would do about it. I mean, clearly we need some kind of coming together of reasonable Western countries to sign some kind of pandemic treaty agreeing to be transparent about what's going on, agreeing to share information if an incident happens, and gradually get enough countries to sign such a treaty so that it becomes embarrassing for the Chinese that they're not part of it. We also need to, be careful with the rhetoric so that we don't think the Chinese so the Chinese don't think we're just out to throw mud at them. Because actually the model here that I like, that I keep coming back to, is the airline industry, which has become very good at sharing information from accidents so that everybody learns, so that the emphasis is on learning lessons rather than throwing around blame. And that surely is a model. If we can somehow at the highest level say to the Chinese, this is what we're after. We're after learning a lesson here. Is the lesson that we need to regulate the wildlife trade differently, or is the lesson that we need to avoid doing certain experiments? Then maybe we can have a better conversation after that. But it won't be easy. But at the same time, I don't like it when people say to me, look, we better not find out, because if we do find out that it came from a lab, we'll have a row with China. And that would be a bad thing. I mean, I'm sorry, the truth is more important than that.
Yeah, that's for sure. Switching topics just for a moment, before I let you go, because I find your thoughts and your writings interesting on the nature of man, the nature, the benefits of the market economy, the nature of human flourishing, the story of human flourishing. I think it's a lot of what we talked about last time on the podcast. One question I have, it's not really something I've given a lot of thought to, but having you on reminds me of it, which is how we can help conservatism grow internationally. Right? I'm always thinking about that politically here in the U.S. And I'm curious how you see our brand of conservatism here in the Republican Party. Curious how that looks from across the pond. It's something I'm hyper focused on at the moment because I'm concerned with the left. I know who they are, but the real backstabbers are always on your own side. They're always in your own midst. And I don't know if you guys have this problem, but we have this tendency in our Republican Party where a person's not getting enough attention. They know that because our voter base is frankly worried about someone betraying them. They're worried about big government. They're worried about people infringing on their rights. So they're always looking for betrayal. And it's very easy to convince them of the betrayal. It's very easy to one up your fellow conservatives in very seditious and dishonest ways. We had this vote last week about vaccine database, this supposed vaccine database created. And people just lied about it. I mean, they straight up said a vaccine database was created. This just isn't true. It's just completely false. It was the exact opposite, actually. It was the restrictions on existing databases that would, make sure that you actually can't share individual data. And yet at the highest levels of, Fox News and members of our own party, they just lied about it. And it was, now I think I successfully debunked those lies, but I'm very lucky to have a platform where I can do that and I can escape these things. But gosh, it would be so easy for me to just do the opposite and be like, I am not like those. We call them rhinos. Okay. It's called Republicans in names only. I don't know if you have a term for rhinos. And it's, it will be the death of the conservative movement, these opportunists. And, granted, they've always existed. So maybe I'm overstating that, but I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, it's a really good and interesting question and a difficult one. I've always wrestled with the question: could you have a party that was, classically liberal, free market? Would that be enough to win votes, or do you have to ally that with some kind of social conservatism, as people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did? And then I wrestle with the question: why don't facts persuade people? I try and I say to people, look, in my lifetime, global percentage of people living in extreme poverty has gone from 55% to less than 8%. That's an extraordinary achievement. Why don't you think why do you think the world's getting worse, etc.? But facts don't seem to have that much impact on people, to my disappointment. And so a lot of it's about culture and so on. And then you hitch your political philosophy to particular personalities. Boris Johnson is a very good example of someone who cheers people up when things are going well. He seems to be a nice guy. He's been a fantastically charismatic ambassador for conservatism of a generally upbeat liberal kind. Yet he's now in significant political difficulty at the moment and becoming more and more unpopular. So how do you find? The other thing that strikes me is how incredibly unusual the Reagan-Thatcher period was. We've slipped back into a much more statist view of what conservatism should be in this country. I don't think you have necessarily in the US, but that's a tricky one to solve.
Yeah, in your question about can you be socially liberal and a Republican, and the answer is no, you can't. Now you can imagine a district that's like 50-50, but to imagine that Republican that would, let's call them a pro-choice, let's just say pro-choice. I think that's probably the most salient issue here is abortion. Yeah. And I'm not sure a single Republican is pro-choice, and there's good reason for that. I mean, you can't win the primary. Our base would never let a Republican win the primary, even if they knew that a Democrat would win otherwise. Because if facts don't persuade people, strategy certainly doesn't either. And frankly, on our side, that's the main divide because, if you look at our fringe elements versus the moderate elements, I often say, if the fringe crazies were in charge, I'm not sure it would actually be that bad. They wouldn't do much to you. They would repeal a bunch of laws. You wouldn't have many services, maybe. But all in all, like you'd probably be left alone. So it's not that big of a deal. And maybe that's like extreme libertarianism,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But yes, they're mad. They sound a little wacko. They're a little conspiratorial, but they're not trying to control your life. And that matters. That counts for something. Because I'm much more scared of the well-meaning authoritarians with a master's degree.
Absolutely. And the knee-jerk assumption that if something needs to be done, it must be done by government, is the one that drives me around the bend. I love saying to people, look, 10 million people eat lunch in London every day. Nobody makes up their mind what they're going to eat until the last minute, or even where they're going to eat. And yet somehow the right amount of food is in the right place at the right time with surprisingly little wastage. How on earth does that happen? Who's in charge? Who's the London Lunch Commissioner? Give that man a raise, because he's obviously doing an incredible job. And of course, he isn't in charge. There is no such person. It's a mark. If there was someone in charge, it would be an absolute disaster. And yet, when we come to healthcare or something, we just assume that we must, particularly in this country, have this highly centralized system in which political decisions drive everything, rather than let supply and demand sort it out in a much more localized and sort of liberal, in my view, way. We're terribly top down in the way we think about new questions.
Yeah, it's frustrating on the healthcare issue. I'm desperately trying to come up with what the Republican plan is, that both, because for healthcare you do need a safety net. Now,
yes.
But you can take that idea way too far, which is what I believe the UK has done, is taken it too far. You basically have a giant Veterans Affairs system. I know that's how I would describe it, right? It might even go further than that, because even at the VA,
Europe has a sensible hybrid system where the government pays for health, but the private sector provides it. Basically through various kinds of insurance systems and so on. So the government can say, look, that's too expensive. I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to go to this supplier. Or that you're not saving enough lives. I'm going to go to that supplier. So that seems to me neither the American nor the British system. And on the whole, you find that if you go to Germany and France, they don't have a big political row about health at every election. No,
they don't. We certainly do. I've done plenty of podcasts about healthcare. I'm not sure I want to go too far into it. But back to conservatism, I would also say this: the other reason that a Republican can't be pro-choice is because it wouldn't be consistent from a principled standpoint. Now, if you're a libertarian, it would be consistent. Libertarians can be pro-choice. But to be a conservative, to me, is something different. It means that we care quite a bit about the nature of rights, and also what our founding documents say. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to conserve, is our founding documents. And by our estimation, if you have a right to life, liberty, and property, then you can't kill someone. And we all agree that you can't kill someone. So maybe our disagreement in America is, and in Europe and everywhere, although we have the conversation in a much more heated way here in the U.S. about abortion. Yep. The question is it a life? And but the thing is, what frustrates conservatives is the left doesn't even really try to make the argument that it's not a life. They kind of accept that it is and move past it and say, yeah, but it's like, she wants, but the mom wants an education. And we're like, that's not a good argument. It's not a good argument at all. It's like, who else can you kill because they're inconvenient? I mean, that's not a good argument. I don't know. Do you guys even have that debate?
Well, we hardly do. Abortion is very, very rarely a political issue here, and that's partly because it's not sort of through through a constitutional or a Supreme Court angle. It's just we had legislation a long time ago saying you can have abortions up to a certain age, time or whatever, and that's it. And basically that holds. We don't.
What is it? What is the limit? Out of curiosity,
I can't even remember. That shows you how non-live an issue.
I have looked it up I can't remember what the UK is, but like in France it's 12 weeks. Sweden, these countries it's 12 weeks, and that shocks American liberals. It shocks them. I'm like, because they think Europe is super liberal in every single way, and it's not always the case.
Right. I mean, I'm generally pro choice, but I'm not in favor of near birth abortion or something like that. I've no idea where I would draw the line. Another good example of this, though, is stem cell embryo research. 40 years ago in the UK, we had a big commission about this big debate and said, right, we're going to have a 14-day limit. You can do experiments on human embryos in the lab, but only up to 14 days. After that, you must stop. And that, again, has held as a compromise ever since. So there was a period, basically, I think in the Bush administration, when scientists in the US were sometimes coming to the UK because they were able to do experiments that were more controversial in the US. And so I mean, we're surprisingly, as a country, we don't get hung up on that. We get terribly hung up on lots of other issues. But so here's a cynical way of putting it: you mess with our tomatoes genetically, and we get yes. But babies, fine, do what you like.
It's just funny what riles people up, and it's almost like it's human nature to just seek out these divisions, like this way to plant your flag and to stand for a cause. Everybody's got their thing, and I'm not a very emotional person, so and I've always characterized myself as somebody who just steps back and thinks in broader terms. So it's very hard for me to understand the emotions of somebody who cares only about one single issue. That's why I think it's so important to defend conservatism, because conservatism is a framework with which to interpret problems. Right. And I get really frustrated with my own side if we're not consistent in how we interpret those things. And I get frustrated when it's manufactured divisions, like I expressed to you earlier. People seeking to claim something that isn't true. And what's frustrating about that vaccine database thing is we all agree there shouldn't be a vaccine database. Right. You're just saying that there is one when there's not one. Right. And then and how stupid is this? How stupid is this?
Yeah, we have had actually a similar argument here. It turns out that there's a phrase in the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union that says because animals are sentient, or some animals are sentient, therefore you should take their welfare into account. It's a very short statement, and the only reason it's so short and vague is because the Spanish objected to anything stronger because it would outlaw bullfighting. Now, when we transposed European law into British law at Brexit, we didn't bother bringing that particular phrase into any English law. And some eagle-eyed political strategists decided to weaponize this and get up a writing campaign to MPs saying, can you believe it? This dreadful government is trying to deny that animals are sentient by not bringing this phrase across. Well, that's nonsense. We've had animal welfare legislation since the 1820s, and it has assumed that animals are sentient. Not all animals, but, cows and pigs. And the reason their welfare matters is because they are capable of consciousness and pain and things like that. So this was a completely fake sort of astroturfing exercise. But it resulted in the UK government, in a moral panic, bringing forward a whole bill to say, right, in that case, don't worry, we're going to sort this. We're going to have a sentience committee that will test all government policy to check whether it affects sentient animals. Well, we've already got a welfare committee that does exactly that. How is this going to be any different? We spent a whole day discussing that bill on Monday, and we were trying to get out of the government, please explain how this is going to work, why it isn't just going to turn into a bureaucratic monster, and what it adds that we're not already doing. And the government kept saying it's going to send a strong signal, but it's not going to have any power. Well, sorry, that doesn't make sense.
What's the point?
So it's just like your thing. It was based on a false premise, the whole debate.
Yeah, and another question I have, maybe a tougher one. Free speech is a big deal here, and we have a First Amendment. You guys don't have this Bill of Rights that is very difficult to change the way we have here. I'm wondering, do you wish you did? Because especially when it comes to free speech. And, we do see this in the UK. I think we see much scarier versions in Germany when it comes to hate speech laws and harmful speech laws and, people being prosecuted for these things, which would be unimaginable here. Now we have an entire political party that would love to see you prosecuted for it. But luckily they are powerless to enforce that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, a good example of that is that the police have developed a category called a non-crime hate incident.
Oh, dear God.
So they're saying you've done something that's not a crime, but it's been recorded as a hate incident because someone told us that they thought you were being hateful in what you did. Okay, but it doesn't meet the threshold of a crime. We're going to keep a record of that.
What?
We're going to keep on record that you committed a hate crime, a non-crime hate incident 10 years ago or whatever. And we've been trying to change that and say, look, either the guy committed a crime, in which case you can keep a record of what he did, or he didn't, in which case you should expunge the record from this. Now, under your constitution, it would be unimaginable for the police to be allowed to do that, I think. And so, sometimes we do look across the Atlantic and say we wish we had amendments to the Constitution, Bill of Rights, to be able to defend this kind of stuff. But if you look at the free speech debate generally, the cancellation of people in universities, etc., it's following a very similar course in the UK and the US.
Yeah, we probably started it, to be honest, when it comes to the cancel culture side of things. It's like you guys are worse on the law. We're worse on the culture. I think our radical leftists are far more radical than European leftists. That seems to be the case from my estimation. And
striking that, because it wasn't the case when I was living in Washington in the 80s. The left felt fairly far right to us compared with our near communist Labour Party at the time. And the right felt really quite moderate, so there wasn't a great difference between them. Now you've got far greater polarization than we have, actually.
Yeah, well, it seems that way. I'm just curious from a legal perspective on this non-crime hate speech. Like how on earth do they even legislate that? How do you? This is something we struggle with constantly, and it's the point we make constantly: is you can't define hate speech. You can't standardize it. So, protected First Amendment speech to us here is anything that falls short of incitement to violence. And incitement to violence is a very clear threshold. It has to be definable. So how the heck do we define hate speech? And how are they doing it there when they and do they give you a ticket? Or is it, this almost sounds like a Chinese social credit. It's kind of freaky.
Yeah, it's heading that way. I think they define it by the reaction of the victim. Not the victim,
horrible.
The recipient.
Yeah.
Somebody goes to the police and says, I have been subjected to hate speech because, somebody was rude to me in the street. This
sounds so British. I'm sorry. This sounds so eminently British.
But I think they have to go a bit further than that and say, I think they were being rude to me because I'm
right,
because of the color of my skin or because of my sex or something like that. And the police will then say, right, well, if you think that, then it must be true. And that, of course, is mad because it's a recipe for vexatious complaining. And there have been some very notorious cases of people getting other people into trouble by claiming they said hateful things when they didn't.
But even if they did, even if it's written down in an email and you're like, look at these hateful things. They said it. It's right there. They called me this name, a racial epithet. Even then, what's the standard? Is there a nice way to criticize? And what's the threshold? And I know there's no answer to this, but it's just it blows my mind.
I agree. Incitement is surely the key threshold point, and we need to get back to that.
It's simple classical liberalism, and I've kept you for a while, and I think I have to go too. But I love these conversations. I think they're very enlightening. to have with smart
Me
people,
too.
especially across the pond. And I hope that together we can help create a cultural resurgence for the wonderful tradition that is conservatism.
Thank you, and me too. And great to talk, Dan. And keep well.
Thank you. All right, I'll let you get back to your late night voting via text. Lord Ridley, everybody. Appreciate it.
All the best.